Hi, friends! We're back with our Nancy Drew book, The Secret of the Old Clock by Carolyn Keene. Okay, we're almost done with this book. So let's get started right into it, okay? This chapter is called A Suspenseful Search. Okay. When Nancy awoke the following morning, bright sunlight was streaming through her open bedroom window. As her eyes turned toward the clock on her dresser, she was alarmed to see that it was a little after 9 o'clock. How could I have overslept on a morning like this? She chided herself. Quickly running her hand around under the pillow, she brought out the Crowley notebook and surveyed it with satisfaction. What a surprise the Tophams are going to get, she murmured softly. After hastily bathing and dressing, Nancy hurried downstairs, looking very attractive in a blue summer sweater suit. She kissed Hannah Gruen, who said a cheery good morning and told Nancy that Mr. Drew had already left for his office. Oh dear, Nancy said. I wonder if he forgot our date. No, indeed, the housekeeper replied. He phoned Judge Hart and expects word from him by 10 o'clock. He'll let you know the result. My goodness, Nancy, you've really made a big discovery. I do hope everything turns out for the best. She went into the kitchen and returned in a moment with a plateful of crisp golden waffles. Better eat your breakfast, she advised. Your dad may call any minute. Nancy ate a dish of strawberries, then started on the waffles. These are yummy, she stated, pouring maple syrup over a second one. She had just finished eating when the phone rang. Mr. Drew was calling to say Judge Hart had made arrangements at the bank. Come to my office with the notebook and key, Nancy. We'll start from here. I'll be right down, Dad. Nancy went upstairs for her purse, then drove to her father's office. I have the notebook with me, she told the lawyer. Do you want it? We'll take the book along. I want to show it to the head of the trust department at the bank, Mr. Drew said. It's our proof we have good reason for taking a look at Mr. Crawley's box. After leaving a number of instructions with his private secretary, Carson Drew followed his daughter from the office. He took his place beside her in the convertible. I'll never get over it if we don't find a newer will, Nancy declared. As they drove along, a flush of excitement had tinted her cheeks and her eyes were bright. You must remember one thing, Nancy, returned her father calmly. Crowley was an odd person and did things in an odd way. A will may be there, and again, it may not. Perhaps he only left further instructions to finding it. I remember one case in Canada years ago. An eccentric Frenchman died and left directions to look in a trunk of old clothes for a will. In the pocket of the coat were found further instructions to look in a closet at his home. There, his family found a note telling them to look in a copper boiler. The boiler had disappeared and was finally located in a curiosity shop. Inside, passed on the bottom, was what proved to be a word puzzle in Chinese. The old Frenchman's heirs were about to give up in despair when a Chinese solved the puzzle and the old man's fortune was found. A bag of gold under a board in his bedroom floor. At least they found it, said Nancy. The trip to Masonville was quickly accomplished, and Nancy parked the car in front of the Merchants Trust Company. Father and daughter alighted and entered the bank. Mr. Drew gave his name and asked to see the president. After a few minutes' wait, they were ushered into a private conference room. An elderly man, Mr. Jensen, arose to greet them. The introductions over, Mr. Drew hesitated to state his mission. Before he could finish the story, the bank president broke in. Judge Hart has told me the story. I'll call Mr. Warren, our trust officer. He picked up his desk phone, and in a few minutes, Mr. Warren appeared and was introduced. Nancy now brought out the notebook and opened it to the important page and handed it to the man, who read. When they finished, Mr. Jensen said, "What a mystery!" Mr. Warren pulled from his pocket a file card, which the owner of box 148 had filled out in the name of Josiah Johnston. The two samples of cramped handwritings were compared. I would say, Mr. Drew spoke up, that there is no doubt but that Crowley and Johnston were the same person. I agree, asserted Mr. Jensen, and his trust officer nodded. Then there's no reason why we shouldn't open the box, Mr. Drew asked. None, Mr. Warren replied. Of course, nothing may be removed, you understand? All I want to see, Nancy spoke up, is whether there is a will in the box, the date on it, who the executor was, and who the heirs are. The banker smiled, and Mr. Jensen said, "You are hoping to solve 4 mysteries all at once? Well, let's get started. With Mr. Warren in the lead, the four walked toward the rear of the bank to the vault of the trust department. A guard opened the door and they went through. Mr. Jensen took the key from the Crowleys' notebook. When Mr. Warren opened the first part of the double safety lock with the bank key, then he inserted the key from the notebook. It fitted. In a moment, he lifted out deposit box number 148. It was a small one, not heavy, he said. We'll take this into a private room, Mr. Jensen stated. He, Nancy, and Mr. Drew followed the trust officer down a corridor of cubbyhole rooms until they reached one not in use. Now, said Mr. Jensen, when the door was closed behind them, we shall see how many, if any, of these mysteries are solved. Nancy held her breath as he raised the lid off the box. All peered inside. The box was empty except for one bulky document in the bottom. Oh, it must be the will, Nancy exclaimed. It is a will, Mr. Jensen announced, after a hasty glance at the first page. Josiah Crowley's last will and testament. When was it written? Nancy asked quickly. In March of this year, Mr. Jensen told her. Oh, Dad, cried Nancy, this was later than the will the Tophams submitted to probate. That's right. Let's read it right away, Nancy begged. Mr. Jensen handed the sheets to Mr. Drew. Maybe you can decipher this. The handwriting is too much for me. The lawyer took the will. Then, as Nancy looked over his shoulder, he haltingly read aloud, giving the interpretation rather than a word-by-word account. Mr. Jensen, Mr. Warren, your bank has been named an executor, he said. Very good, the president smiled, but I expect Mr. Topham won't be happy to hear this. Mr. Drew had turned to the last page. The signature of Josiah is in order, he remarked, and there are two witnesses, Dr. Nesbitt and Thomas Wackley. No wonder this will didn't come to light. Both of the men died in April. As Nancy tried to decipher the handwriting, she noticed to her delight that the Hoover girls had Abby Rowan were mentioned. At this moment, the president said, Mr. Drew, the bank's regular lawyer, had just left for Europe and an extended vacation. Since you and your daughter have solved the mystery and are so vitally interested in it, you could handle the case for us. Nancy's eyes sparkled as Mr. Drew smiled. I'd certainly be very glad to, he said. What instructions have you for us? Mr. Warren asked. Mr. Drew thought a moment and then said, because of the unusual aspects of this case, I believe first of all, I'd like you to have photostats of this will made, and I can study the contents carefully. We'll be happy to do that, Mr. Jensen replied after them. After I'm sure everything is legal, Mr. Drew went on, I'll deliver the original will for probate and notify the people who will benefit from Mr. Crowley's estate. Fine, said Mr. Jensen. We have photostating equipment right here. I'll have a couple of copies made while you wait. Or shall I send them to your office? Mr. Drew glanced at his daughter. We'll wait, he said, smiling. While the photostats were being made, Nancy's mind was racing. Oh, I hope Allison receives enough money to pay for her singing lessons, and the other deserving people get nice amounts, she whispered to her father, who nodded. The wait seemed interminable to Nancy, who could not sit still. She walked back and forth until finally her father remarked teasingly, You're like a caged lion. Nancy pretended to pout. At least I'm not growling, she said, and Mr. Drew grinned. As soon as a messenger brought back the will together with the two photostats of the documents. Thank you, said Mr. Jensen, who handed the photostatic copies to Mr. Drew. I'll work on this at once, the lawyer promised. As he put the papers in his briefcase, then his daughter left the bank. Mr. Drew insisted that he and Nancy stop for lunch and refused to let her look at the will while they were waiting to be served. Relax, young lady, he warned. There's no point in letting any prying eyes know our secret. As he saw his daughter's animation fading, Mr. Drew said, Suppose you come to my office with me and we'll work on the problem together. I'll have the will typed. In this way, its full meaning can be understood more easily. Oh, thanks, Dad, said Nancy. In the lawyer's office, the young sleuth sat down beside the typist, Miss Lambie. As each page came from the machine, Nancy read it avidly. Mr. Crowley certainly seemed to know the correct phraseology for drawing up a will, she remarked. Finally, when the typing had been completed, Nancy said to the secretary, I have a lot of questions to ask Dad. Miss Lambie smiled. If they're legal ones, he'll know all the answers, she said. There's no better lawyer in River Heights than your father. Nancy smiled as she dashed into her father's office. The two Drews sat down to study Josiah's last will and testament. If this does prove to be legal, said Nancy, it will certainly blow the Tophams blow to the Tophams. I'm afraid so, Dad. When you call a meeting of all the relatives and read the will aloud, Nancy said, please may it be there. Nancy Drew laughed. I'll humor you this time, Nancy. You may be present when the Tophams get the surprise of their lives. And that is the end of that chapter. So we have 2 chapters left and then our book is done. So I wonder what the Tophams are going to say when they find out about this will Nancy found. We will find out tomorrow. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye, friends.